In pop culture, the American Old West is painted with vivid strokes. Rugged cowboys riding into sunsets, deadly duels at high noon, and dusty saloons packed with gunslingers and gamblers. But as exciting as these tales are, much of what we know about the Wild West has more to do with Hollywood's imagination than reality. In truth, the real West was far more complex, diverse, and even strange than most myths suggest.
Most cowboys didn't wear cowboy hats. The cowboy hat, often embodied by the classic Stetson, is the defining accessory of the iconic cowboy image. Of course, the boots are also essential, but the hat stands out as both functional and unmistakably stylish. Designed to be lightweight and practical, these hats were crafted with utility in mind. The wide brim and curved edges offered solid protection from harsh sun and unexpected rain, and they added a touch of flair to the otherwise rugged task of long hours spent tending cattle. With its distinctive dips in the crown, the band, and that broad curved brim, the Stetson is as recognizable as any piece of Western gear. But if you were to set a time machine for 1870 and take a look around, the hat most often associated with cowboys today might be hard to find. While hats were indeed an essential part of daily attire for men of the era, what they wore in the Old West was often quite different from the Stetson-style cowboy hat we imagine. A surprising variety of headwear was popular, from bowlers to flat-topped hats. Historical photos reveal figures like Billy the Kid sporting a makeshift top hat, while Wild Bill Hickok was known to wear a flat, pancake-shaped hat. For many Westerners, the bowler hat was a staple. Its popularity stemmed from its versatility, making it suitable for a range of social settings. Western historian Lucius Beebe even referred to the bowler as the hat that won the West, a testament to its prominence. A glance at portraits from that time reveals that bowler hats were often the headwear of choice for many prominent figures, signaling status and a certain sense of style. Interestingly, the Stetson itself has changed significantly over the years. The first version, known as the Boss of the Plains, had a simpler design more reminiscent of a modern Amish hat or even a modified sombrero. Over time, the Stetson evolved with added curves, ornamentation, and style flourishes that shaped it into the cowboy hat we know today. This early design paved the way for modern cowboy hats, but it might not align with the hat image most of us picture when we think of the Old West. In reality, the cowboy hat as we know it is an evolution of practical needs and aesthetic preferences that developed well after the frontier era. While today's Stetson remains the symbol of the cowboy, the hats worn during the true Old West era were far more varied than we might imagine. Playing cards was not just a pastime. In countless Western movies, a card game can turn life or death in seconds, with tempers flaring and fortunes at stake. However, in the real Old West, high-stakes card playing was not something every cowboy or drifter engaged in. Gambling was taken seriously, and for many it was a recognized profession. Only skilled and seasoned players would participate in the most competitive games, where the best gamblers were respected as professional sportsmen, a title reflecting their expertise and dedication to the game. The Old West was home to numerous gambling halls, saloons, and brothels that catered specifically to competitive card games. These establishments offered far more than casual games of chance. They hosted formalized tournaments and competitions where skilled players vied for substantial rewards. Unlike the casual portrayals in popular culture, these games were often structured, with experienced gamblers facing off in carefully arranged settings. Rather than spontaneous games between novices and seasoned players, most high-stakes tables were set up for serious competitors who honed their skills and followed established codes of conduct. The reputation of these games and the gamblers who frequented them adds a layer of professionalism and respect to the Old West gambling scene that movies rarely capture. The real story of card playing in the Old West reflects a disciplined world where skill, reputation, and strategy were valued as much as luck. Guns were rampant in the Wild West. Although cowboy hats are central to the cowboy image today, the classic idea of cowboys always carrying six-shooters is another misconception. We imagine that every man, woman, and even child in the Old West had a revolver at their side for self-defense, hunting, or even celebration. But while firearms were certainly present, gun control measures in the 19th and early 20th centuries were surprisingly stringent, and especially in Western towns. As settlements developed into established communities, the once common sight of handguns became less tolerated, reflecting the desire for order over chaos. In the early days, violence did occur as frontier areas had few formal laws and little means to enforce them. However, by 1878, around 25 years after the westward migration began, towns were taking clear action to restrict firearms. Signs posted in places like Dodge City warned people against carrying guns in town limits. The infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, in fact, was sparked by one gang's refusal to obey Tombstone's gun restrictions, illustrating how serious these laws were. The six-shooter itself wasn't as lethal or reliable as one might think. Early revolvers didn't use modern bullets. Instead, they relied on a cap and ball mechanism, which essentially fired a small marble propelled by black powder. These guns had an effective range of only about 50 feet, making them less accurate and powerful than today's firearms. The Adams revolver, an iconic weapon of the era, often burned the shooter's hand upon firing, so using it was not without risk. For this reason, even those who carried guns often treated their six-shooters as weapons of last resort. For most frontier folk, shotguns and rifles were the weapons of choice. These provided greater power and range, which was essential for protecting livestock or hunting large animals. Rifles were far more practical for the daily demands of the West than a revolver, which was seen more as a backup than a primary weapon. The romanticized image of two cowboys squaring off at high noon with pistols is more a product of Hollywood than reality, as such encounters were rare, and practical needs often took precedence over flashy duels. Ultimately, while firearms were a part of life in the Old West, the approach to carrying and using them was often cautious and regulated. The myth of a gun-toting, lawless West persists, but the reality was far more restrained and practical than legend suggests. Cowboys are an American creation. One reason Americans have such an enduring fascination with the Old West is that it feels uniquely American, a story of rugged independence and frontier spirit. Even today, images of cowboy hats and Western garb are common at patriotic gatherings, symbolizing a deep connection between cowboy culture and American identity. Theodore Roosevelt famously leaned into this sentiment by branding himself the cowboy candidate. Yet interestingly, the cowboy wasn't originally an American creation at all. In fact, cowboys have their roots in Mexican culture, predating the founding of America by about 20 years. The first cowboys were Mexican cattle herders known as vaqueros, and they embodied everything we associate with cowboy life today. The vaqueros coined much of the language we still use, such as bronco, lariat, and stampede, and they were experts at the long cattle drives we often picture in Western scenes. Their attire, including wide-brimmed hats or sombreros in chaps, was also an early influence on what would become the classic cowboy look. They lived this lifestyle for nearly 2 centuries, cultivating skills and traditions long before American settlers headed west. As settlers expanded into these Western territories, they quickly saw the expertise of the vaqueros and relied on them to learn the ways of cattle driving and survival on the open range. This influence was so strong that settlers adopted not only the practices, but also much of the vaquero culture, adapting even the term vaquero into buckaroo. It's a story of cultural exchange, though one-sided, as much of what we recognize as cowboy culture today was directly shaped by these Mexican cattlemen. Hollywood's portrayal of the cowboy, however, has often been incomplete. In reality, cowboys were far more diverse than popular media suggests. Historical records indicate that roughly 1 in 3 cowboys were Mexican, and about 1 in 4 were black. many of whom were formerly enslaved people who stayed in the West to work in cattle after gaining their freedom. Native Americans also played roles on cattle drives, working alongside white, black, and Mexican cowboys. It was a unique, multi-ethnic coalition that kept the cattle industry moving forward. Yet for many, including Chinese immigrants, opportunities in the cattle industry were limited. They faced harsh conditions working on the railroads, which played an equally critical role in connecting the expanding West. So while the cowboy remains an icon of American identity, the real story is one of cultural exchange and a diversity that rarely appears in the mythic version of the Old West. Bank robbing outlaws ruled the Wild West. Legends like Black Bart, the Dalton Gang, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are well known for their bold heists, targeting banks with minimal security that today might be compared to a modern concession stand. In a time when local law enforcement was spread thin and bank vaults were rudimentary at best, many assumed that Old West banks were easy targets, practically inviting criminals to help themselves to the cash. However, historical records show only about 8 true bank robberies in a span of 40 years across 15 states. By contrast, in 2010 alone, there were over 5,600 bank robberies in the U.S. Even without the Hollywood image of Wild West crime, this number seems surprisingly low. Several factors made bank robberies rare and challenging. For one, towns were small, with essential establishments: the sheriff's office, bank, general store, and saloon, usually located close together in the center of town. This layout created a Main Street effect, where any commotion near the bank could quickly draw the attention of the nearby sheriff's office. Attempting a daytime robbery would likely be within earshot of local law enforcement, making the whole endeavor more high risk than glamorous. Additionally, these banks were often designed to deter would-be thieves. Western buildings, though simple, were tightly packed along main streets, which limited access points. A bank might be bordered on either side by other structures, while thick back walls prevented entry from behind. This close layout created a bottleneck effect, forcing robbers to exit through the front, where they could easily be intercepted by local law officers or townspeople. The security, while basic by modern standards, was often effective enough to dissuade criminals. While daring heists like those carried out by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid did occur, they stand out in history precisely because of their rarity and audacity. Cassidy and the Sundance Kid became legendary, not just for their skill, but because they pulled off robberies that few others dared to attempt. For most outlaws, banks weren't practical targets. Trains and stagecoaches, on the other hand, were more accessible and isolated, offering more opportunity for a swift and unimpeded getaway. So while bank robberies are a staple in Wild West lore, they were far from the norm. Criminals of the Old West preferred targets that offered a more straightforward approach, knowing that a heist in the middle of town, with witnesses and law enforcement nearby, was as likely to fail as it was to succeed. Settlers were constantly clashing with Native Americans. Old Western films often portray Native Americans as relentless attackers, much like the way The Walking Dead treats zombies, an ever-present threat capable of ambushing settlers from any direction at any time. In these dramatizations, any journey into so-called Indian territory was seen as perilous, demanding careful preparation and heavy armament. The famous image of a wagon train encircled for defense in the face of an impending raid by Cherokee, Sioux, or other tribes still lingers in our minds today, encapsulating a defensive instinct that led to the enduring phrase, "circle the wagons." And because history recounts large losses of life during westward expansion, it's easy to assume that pioneers faced continuous skirmishes, with arrows whizzing by and guns blazing daily. The reality, however, tells a very different story. Although violent encounters certainly occurred between the United States military and native tribes, resulting in a tragic history of battles and massacres, the average settler traveling westward rarely faced such attacks. Actual conflicts between wagon trains and Native Americans were sporadic rather than common, and evidence reveals that out of the hundreds of thousands of pioneers who crossed territories like Nebraska on their way to the Pacific, only around 300 to 400 died due to altercations with native tribes. This number is astonishingly low when compared to overall fatalities on the trail. To put this in perspective, the Oregon Trail alone claimed between 10,000 and 30,000 lives due to various causes, with disease, harsh weather, and accidents far outweighing violent encounters in terms of mortality. Deaths from cholera, dysentery, or exposure were far more likely to end a pioneer's journey than a clash with native people. In fact, confrontations with Native Americans accounted for a mere 1 to 4% of all pioneer fatalities on these trails. And ironically, the odds of a settler suffering a fatal accident with their own livestock, say a mule or cow, were often greater than facing a hostile encounter. During the same era, settlers killed an estimated 400 Native Americans in violent incidents. While this figure is significant, it illustrates that most settlers did not face or engage in deadly clashes with native tribes. In reality, it was much more common for pioneers to encounter Native Americans in nonviolent ways, such as trading goods or hiring them as guides. This wasn't necessarily due to any ideal of harmony or cultural openness. Practicality and necessity played the larger role. Maintaining peaceful relationships often meant easier and safer travel for the settlers, and good business for native communities who provided valuable services. For instance, hiring a native guide was more than a convenience, it was a lifeline. Navigating the vast and uncharted landscapes of the West could mean the difference between life and death, especially for those unfamiliar with the harsh terrain. Contrary to popular belief, the image of settlers encircling their wagons to fend off native raids is largely a myth. For most travelers, forming a ring of wagons each night was a practical solution to keep their livestock, which was a valuable asset, from wandering off in the open prairies. And in the event of a sudden attack, circling wagons quickly was virtually impossible. Wagon trains typically moved in long, spread-out lines, often stretching several miles to avoid each other's dust, muddy ruts, and discarded waste. Gathering everyone into a defensive formation would have taken precious hours, a delay that could be fatal in a real emergency. As for the broader conflict, the U.S. government and military were responsible for countless Native American deaths, with estimates reaching into the millions due to forced relocations, wars, and systemic policies aimed at displacement. These tragic events had a profound impact on Native communities, but individual skirmishes with settlers on wagon trains made up only a small fraction of these encounters. Misunderstandings of these dynamics stem from exaggerated stories and a skewed view of the West that focuses on sensational conflict. In truth, settlers and Native Americans often found themselves in mutual dependence, relying on exchanges that made surviving the arduous trek westward possible.
Please like and share if you find the video content interesting and useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss the upcoming interesting videos. Thanks for watching.